Anakin's gone. I am what remains. I am not your failure, Obi-Wan. You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker. I did.
I've always wanted to make a damaged Darth Vader helmet, but the thought of what to do with it afterwards always stopped me. After all, what's the point of making a damaged Darth Vader helmet without Darth Vader himself wearing it? That all changed once I found a realistic head sculpt of Vader that could be 3D printed. So not only am I going to show you how to take a raw 3D print and turn it into something with a perfectly smooth mirror-like finish, but I'm also going to show you how I made and painted this head sculpt of Darth Vader. Links to the STL files and all materials used will be in the description, so without wasting any more time, let's start at the beginning. I've decided the most efficient way to structure this video is to first show how the helmet was made, then go back and do the same for the head sculpt. Since these are basically two separate builds in one video, I felt as though jumping back and forth between them would be jarring, and would increase the risk of me skipping over important details. The helmet was printed at 100% scale across several printers. For whatever reason, DO3D used two different size magnet holes in order to assemble the helmet. The neck collar piece uses 8x2mm magnets, which is perfect. However, the upper face portion and the lower chin portion connect using what I believe were 6mm magnets, which, as you can see, clearly weren't strong enough to hold it together. If anyone watching has made this helmet before, I'm curious whether or not you experienced the same issue I did. To work around this, I decided to glue the pieces together, then use my soldering iron to weld along the connection seams on the inside of the helmet. While my soldering iron was still hot, I made my own modifications to the helmet. If you compare the DO3D model to the actual screen-used prop, you'll notice just how much detail there is on the screen-used version. The detail that stands out the most to me is this sharp, flared-out piece of the helmet. So, using a heat gun, pliers, and my soldering iron, I heated and shaped the plastic, bending it outwards, in order to replicate the screen-used version as best I could. In addition to that, the damage on the DO3D model looked way too neat and artificial, so I used my soldering iron to emphasize some of the details, and made it appear as though the plastic was actually burned and melted through, rather than printed. With my own modifications made, it was now time to start sanding. I'll be honest with you here, I took a shortcut this time around. I knew going into this build that I wanted the dome to be permanently attached, so anything above the brow line would never be visible. I have pretty bad OCD when it comes to stuff like this, so as painful as this was to do, I didn't sand any of the upper portions of the helmet. After a round of power sanding, I used the commonly known filler products to fill imperfections. I like to experiment with different products from time to time, so after hearing good things about Rust-Oleum's filler primer, not their sandable version, just their regular filler primer, I gave it a shot and found that it worked pretty well. Plus, it doesn't gunk up your sandpaper nearly as much as the sandable version. Along with filler primer, I used Bondo's glazing putty to fill larger imperfections, repeating this whole process over and over again. If you saw my last video where I made a weathered Scout Trooper helmet, you'll know that I added a new step into my sanding ritual. I will now be logging all of the hours I spent sanding on a particular project. In total, it took me 9.5 hours to get this helmet smooth and ready for paint. From this point forward, I no longer handle the helmet with my bare hands. I instead wear gloves to prevent the transfer of fingerprints or oils onto the helmet's surface. I then used a Rust-Oleum flat black primer and applied 3 coats onto each part of the helmet. It was at this moment where I got the idea of trying something new. I've recently been feeling resentment and frustration towards spray paint. Clogged nozzles, chunky and runny paint, orange peel, runs and drips even when following the can's instructions. Due to those reasons, I decided to use an airbrush for the remainder of this build. But that wasn't the only new thing I experimented with. The black primer I had just sprayed was a little chunky and had a noticeable amount of orange peel, so I decided to wet sand the base coat with 2000 grit sandpaper. I would love to hear from you guys what your opinions on this decision are. Personally, I feel that since I'm going to be spraying a top coat, the quality of the base coat doesn't matter nearly as much, as wet sanding, buffing, and polishing the clear coat will take care of most of it. Obviously, imperfections in the base coat like runs, debris, and hair would need to be wet sanded out, but imperfections such as orange peel are what I was mostly curious about. I wondered whether or not a wet sanded base coat would result in a higher quality top coat. One thing that's really unique about Vader's helmet in the Kenobi series is the paint combination on the face, that being gloss black and this dark metallic gray, which appears to have more of a satin or matte finish, as opposed to the original trilogy helmets, which had glossy metallic highlights instead. There's an amazing video on Adam Savage's Tested channel where he gets a behind-the-scenes look at the actual screen-used suit, as well as the damaged version of Vader's helmet as seen in the show. So when it came to painting this helmet, that video was my main source of reference. Achieving a satin metallic finish, however, proved to be challenging. This was a hurdle that I became obsessed with overcoming, and it took a lot of experimentation in order to solve. Most metallic paints naturally have a glossy finish, and attempting to alter the sheen of metallic paint is a very tricky thing to do, as you can very easily dull or entirely remove the metallic effect, leaving you with a washed out gray instead. The first step was to find a metallic paint that best matched my references. After doing some research, I found that Vallejo's Metal Colors line of paints had a steel color, which to my eye was a great match. As expected, this paint naturally had a glossy finish. The hard part was figuring out how to tone it down. I did a lot of testing, most of which were unsuccessful. I tried cans of satin and matte clear coat, which immediately destroyed the paint no matter how far away or lightly I sprayed. After sacrificing the lives of countless plastic spoons, the product I found worked best was this Vallejo matte varnish, which was applied using an airbrush. Now that I had the right strategy, it was time to apply it to the helmet. The last Vader helmet I made, I painted it black first, then added the metallic highlights. I decided to do it the opposite way this time around. Truthfully, I don't know whether or not it's easier starting with black or the metallic gray. Either way, it's a tedious and time-consuming process in order to apply the masking tape. One thing I completely failed to mention in my previous video was the type of masking tape I'm using. I'm using 3M vinyl masking tape that's a 1/4 inch wide but is sold in plenty of other sizes. What's great about this tape is its durability, but most importantly its flexibility. This tape allows you to easily mask off curves and sharp angles, which is essential due to the shape of this helmet. In addition to vinyl masking tape, an X-Acto knife with a new blade is a must. Luckily, since half of this helmet is missing, there's very few areas that need to be painted black, which I quickly did using an airbrush. Once the black was painted, I sprayed a top coat while the masking tape was still applied. I used a lacquer-based gloss clear by Tamaya, and if that seems like a really odd and random choice for a clear coat, that's because it is. My original plan for the metallic gray paint was to use a lacquer-based gunmetal, also by Tamaya, so I went ahead and purchased a lacquer-based clear coat just to be safe. Lacquer paints can be a little risky if you plan on using them with other types of paints, especially enamel paints, as the solvents within the lacquer can eat away at the enamel. However, don't believe everything you read on the internet. On Tamaya's website, it specifically says that lacquer top coats are incompatible with acrylic base coats, which is exactly what you're seeing me do now, and it was totally fine. I'm not the authority on what paints are compatible with what. All I can say is do your own due diligence and test your paints before using them on your builds. I was very concerned when it came time to remove the masking tape. I wasn't sure if the airbrush paint would be durable enough to resist peeling. Luckily, the paint wasn't damaged during removal, which meant I was good to move forward. All that was left was to paint some of the smaller details, as well as the collar piece. With the face portion of the helmet painted, we can now focus on the dome, which is currently primed black and wet sanded. The next step is to apply a top coat, my choice being a 2K polyurethane clear. I won't lie, I was off my game when I clear coated this dome, and I made some rather embarrassing mistakes. Firstly, I forgot to turn on my compressor before I started spraying. Luckily, I was able to notice the compressor not kicking on before the PSI dropped significantly, which would have affected the quality of the clear. Second, I failed to properly clean the lid of the paint cup, which had debris and dried, crusty paint residue from previous uses trapped inside. which naturally mixed together with the clear, resulting in a partial clog, as well as debris being shot from my gun onto the helmet. I tried to salvage the situation as best I could by picking debris off the helmet with a sharp pair of tweezers, then respraying over the area to fill it and let it level out. Unfortunately, I sprayed too close and a little too much, resulting in a decent-sized run down the side of the helmet. Despite my negligence, however, the quality of the finish was actually kind of good, but there was still a good amount of orange peel and debris that had to be dealt with. The through line when making my last Vader helmet was that making mistakes doesn't have to define your project. No matter what mistakes are made, an equal amount of hard work and determination can oftentimes balance things out. That remains true here, and once again, I'm going to show you how to remove orange peel and imperfections from your clear coat. The first step is to wet sand the clear coat. I acknowledge the fact that I went a little overboard in the past, as I wet sanded all the way up to 5,000 grit. In truth, the difference is hardly felt between 3,000 and 5,000, so this time I'm starting at 1,000 grit and working my way up to 3,000 grit. I wanted to correct and clarify something I said in that previous video, so take a listen. The main thing to keep in mind is to be extremely careful not to apply too much pressure. You basically just want to keep the surface as wet as possible and let the sandpaper glide across the surface until you feel the roughness go away. Once the sandpaper can smoothly glide without any resistance, then you're good to go and move up to a finer grit. What I said, while it isn't exactly wrong, is a little vague and leaves a lot to the imagination. Allow me to explain as clearly as possible what you're looking for when wet sanding. The main tips from before still remain. Be very careful not to apply too much pressure, be gentle, and let the sandpaper do all the work. Be sure to keep the surface as wet as possible, and make sure your sandpaper is clean and free of any debris. Now, the most important thing that I failed to mention before is to stop, dry off the area you're sanding, and simply observe. Just because the area you're sanding feels smooth does not mean it's free of any orange peel. If you take a look at the area I was currently sanding, you can clearly see the difference between the spots where there's no orange peel and areas where there's still some residual orange peel left over. Take your time, work one section at a time, and dry the area off every so often to check your progress. I used 1000 grit for a long time, and what you're seeing now is what the surface looked like before I moved up to 1500 grit. Once the orange peel is gone, the remainder of the wet sanding process goes by quick. In total, I spent 3.5 hours wet sanding the helmet, which may seem like a lot of time, but I promise you, the end result is worth it. Now that we're done wet sanding, it's time to bring back the gloss, without any orange peel this time. The last time I showcased the polishing process, I was using a 6-inch orbital polisher. While the coverage was great, it was way too heavy and uncomfortable for me to use on something like this. For this helmet, I'm using a 3-inch orbital polisher, which was a far better experience this time around. To give you a brief rundown on the process, the 2 pads on the left were used to apply compound, while the 2 on the right were used to apply polish. I started with compound first, as it's the more abrasive product. Compound will cut deeper into the surface, removing imperfections and scratches, while also restoring the color and clarity of the paint. I started with a white, heavy-cut wool pad, then worked my way up from left to right. I'm no expert on polishing, but I'll share some tips and guidance that have helped me, that I'm sure even the most experienced out there could agree with. Similar to wet sanding, be mindful of how much pressure you're applying. The pad should never stop spinning as a result of the pressure you apply. Most importantly is to always keep the pad moving, never stay in one spot for too long, as heat is being generated by the pad, which could burn through the clear coat if kept in one place. Take your time and work in small sections, and be sure to use good quality microfiber towels that are clean. The last thing you want is to create additional work for yourself by scratching your helmet with a dirty towel. It took me around 2 hours to polish the entire helmet. I can't stress enough how important it is to not let your mistakes define your projects. Even though I quite frankly butchered the clear coat on this helmet, I didn't have to repaint or start over. I kept moving forward, and was able to turn it around with a little bit of time and a lot of patience. Even though the finish is smooth and has no visible orange peel, it's far from perfect. Despite my efforts, there are still a few pieces of debris that I wasn't able to remove from the finish. Given that this helmet is already a dust magnet, to an untrained eye, they're hardly noticeable. But to me, I see them all. When making something like this, you spend so much time focusing on the imperfections and how to remove them that by the end, the remaining imperfections are sometimes all you see. I have a really hard time being proud of my work. It's been a goal for me recently to not be so hard on myself and to take a step back and focus on all the things that went right rather than wrong. So if you're like me, then let this be a friendly reminder for you to try and do the same. The last thing we need to do before we can move on to the Vader head sculpt is to paint and weather the dome. When looking at reference images, to me the most eye-catching part is this metallic color shift in the middle of the helmet, separating the good side from the damaged side. Using the same Vallejo steel color from earlier, I applied the same effect to mine. This alone immediately changes the entire look and feel of the helmet, and I really like how it looks. I then used a combination of Vallejo's metallic colors, specifically their copper and their metallic blue, and added highlights to various areas, aiding the illusion that the helmet was actually burned and melted through, just like you see on the screen used prop. Somewhere along the way, I ended up slightly bending the needle on my airbrush, and was no longer able to precisely and efficiently paint, so I ended up having to dry brush the remainder of the details. A quick disclaimer, you may notice throughout the remainder of this video that the paint job on the damaged areas changes numerous times. I found myself going back and repainting the damaged areas repeatedly until I was happy with the end result, but I promise you, it's still the same helmet. Once the copper and metallic blue areas were painted, I used metallic rub and buff to add highlights on all the sharp edges of the damaged areas. I sort of cheated when it came to making the lens for this helmet. When making my previous Vader helmet, I made several spare lenses as a contingency, and it just so happened that they were compatible with this helmet. I made the lens by vacuum forming a sheet of PETG and dyeing it black. If you want to see a more in-depth breakdown of this process, then feel free to check out some of my more recent videos. In regards to the color of the lens, before anyone yells at me in the comments saying that they're supposed to be red, in the aforementioned behind the scenes video, while the undamaged version of the helmet clearly has red lenses, the prop makers themselves went on to explain that the damaged version originally had similar color lenses. However, due to the massive opening on the damaged side, too much light was being let in and lit up the eye with too much color, so a black lens was used as a way to compensate. One of the final modifications I made to the helmet was the use of sound deadening foam on the inside for padding. I also strategically placed it in certain areas on the outside of the helmet. The padding on the top serves two purposes. The first is that it allows the dome to sit more securely with much less movement. Secondly, it fills the empty space in the areas above the head. To make it look more authentic, I burned and damaged the sides of the padding as well. At this point, we can now set aside the helmet and begin work on the Vader head sculpt. Before printing the head, I used a 3D scan of my own head as a sizing reference. That way the helmet would fit both me and the Vader head. In a rare moment of foresight on my part, I realized before printing that displaying the helmet with the Vader head inside would have been troublesome because the bottom of the Vader head is a flat surface. I knew that I wanted to make a display stand that incorporated a 1/2-inch PVC pipe for stability. So, I made a 1/2-inch hole at the bottom of the head and extruded a few inches deep into the model. That way the PVC pipe could be slotted inside. After the head was printed, post-processing was slightly different than what I did with the helmet. Since this head is very detailed, using thicker filler products like Bondo or wood filler run the risk of you losing detail. Instead, I used UV resin to fill imperfections. Because resin is more of a liquid, I use a toothpick and add very small amounts directly onto the areas where it's needed. In addition to resin, I once again used Rust-Oleum filler primer and sprayed light coats periodically. Once the head was fully smooth, I went ahead and primed it black, the same way I did with the helmet prior. It's a tradition during every one of my builds that at least one thing goes horrendously wrong and takes years off my life due to the panic and heartache that follows. So allow me to share with you what happened this time. Yeah. After the head was primed and the paint was still fresh, I spun my turntable a little too fast, knocking over the head, and it fell onto the ground. For whatever reason, the universe decided to be kind as the head landed on some spare unopened air filters that I had on the ground. However, even though the head landed on something soft and didn't suffer substantial damage, what it landed on was still dirty and the entire head was covered with debris. So painting was postponed while I wet sanded and re-primed the head. Leading up to the start of this project, I spent weeks obsessing and compiling reference images for this part of the build. I was torn on how I wanted to go about painting this. While other parts of this build, such as the paints used on the helmet, were my attempts to best match what was seen on screen, I took some creative liberty with the head sculpt. Part of me really loves the freshly burned and scarred Revenge of the Sith appearance, but I also like his appearances as seen later on, with pale skin and partially healed burns. So I decided to do my own hybrid of both, with a mix of pale and normal skin tones, as well as burns and scars that appear to have been suffered recently. Now that I had a plan for the paint job, it was time to get to work. To kick things off, I used my airbrush to spray white paint from a top-down angle. That way, any areas where the white paint cannot reach will remain black, acting as natural shading. This technique has really helped me with painting models of all sizes. It's a really simple way to make your paint jobs look high quality. You can even go a step further and use other colors aside from solid black. Darker shades of purple, for example, also look really well as a color for shadows. After the white base was applied, I began work on the skin tone. I started with a regular Vallejo skin tone and built up the color over time with several coats. Once the base skin tone was applied, I used a flat clear coat to seal it. Think of this product as a save button in a video game. Sealing your work as you go grants you flexibility when painting. It allows you to experiment and make mistakes without disturbing the progress beneath it. This was something that I did countless times throughout this build, and if I'm being honest, is the only reason why I was able to finish it in the first place. I then used a pale Vallejo skin color to gradually tone down the skin tone in order to achieve a balance of pale and normal flesh that I wanted, being sure to seal it once I was done. What we do next will immediately start to bring this head to life. Using Vallejo's red flesh color, I mixed that into a very thin wash and covered the entire head with it, allowing it to sit momentarily before dabbing it off with a paper towel. The goal here is to let the wash fill into the detailed areas, the cuts and wrinkles, while also staining the outermost layer of paint, giving the entire head a more realistic appearance. I continued doing this using lighter reds and darker flesh tones than what I originally used. There wasn't a method or anything here. I was constantly referring to my reference images and adding what colors I felt were needed. Once I was done, I knew this would serve as my definitive skin tone moving forward, so I once again sealed it before moving on any further. The next thing I did was add shading around the eyes. I mixed together a combination of reddish flesh tones, as well as a bit of purple for this. I wanted to add more definition to the eyelids, so I went in with a lighter flesh tone to emphasize them. Similar to what I just did with the eyelids, I then used a darker flesh tone and added some darker shading into the scars to make them more defined. I later mixed together a more purplish, darker flesh tone and added some shading around the heavily scarred areas. I tried to better define the burns on the neck, but I wasn't happy with how it looked. It was way too much and looked unnatural. So I used a pale skin tone wash and applied it to the neck area to tone it down, which to my surprise ended up working out perfectly. The wash did a really good job of blending the two colors into something that looked more natural. What happened there was a very common occurrence throughout my time painting, going a little overboard, then toning it down, re-adding color, etc. Getting to this point, while framed in the lens of a video like this, may have seemed like a fast, seamless process, but it was quite the opposite. It was a slow process of trial and error instead. The next thing to do is the eyes. In preparation for that, I ended up spraying 2 coats of clear instead, focusing on the shaded areas around the eyes. That way, any mistakes I could and would make when painting them could be erased without the worry of damaging the surrounding paint. This was easily the most dreaded part of this entire build. The only experience I have painting eyes is on miniatures, where it's easy to make a little look like a lot. This, on the other hand, was essentially a 1-to-1 scale pair of eyes that needed to be painted, so needless to say, I was pretty whelmed. I started by mixing together an off-white to paint the whites of the eyes. I used a combination of skin tone, white, and gray to achieve this color. By now, you should already know what it's time to do. Once the sealer dried, I continued on with the iris. I proceeded very carefully moving forward, and used a sharp pencil to outline the iris on both the eyes the best I could. That way, if I messed up, I could very easily remove the pencil marks. After countless screw-ups and trial and error, I was able to draw a pair of similar sized irises with reference lines indicating where my pupils would be looking. I continued on by painting the iris. Since these are Sith eyes, the outer color of the iris is a darker red, while the inner color is a yellowish orange. So I started with the dark red, then sealed it, before painting the yellow color. I used a pencil once again to mark out the pupils. I decided to have them looking ever so slightly off to the left, towards the damaged side of the helmet. Very carefully, I proceeded to paint them black. I held off on adding any white to the pupils for reflections. Since the eyes were so big, I wanted to wait and see how reflective they were on their own after adding a gloss to them. In order to add some realism to the eyes, I mixed together a red wash and added it to the outermost edges of the eyes to create a bloodshot effect, being sure to keep the head facing upwards long enough to let the paint dry. There was one more thing I did off camera that I should mention. I used a slightly lighter red than what I used on the iris and watered it down significantly, and used it to add some highlights to the irises as they felt a little bland with only 2 distinct colors. With the eyes painted, the next thing I did ended up being a mistake. I wanted to seal the entire head with a satin clear coat, as I thought that would result in a subtle sheen that would look realistic. However, I was completely wrong, and the result was way too glossy. So rather than reapplying a different clear coat, what I ended up doing was using a Vallejo matte varnish and applied that over the satin clear coat with an airbrush. Only then it was time to put the final touches on the eyes, which was a Vallejo gloss varnish, which was applied using a brush. I have no shame in admitting that I lack the talent that some artists have. A gifted painter could have sat down and painted the eyes in one sitting without ever needing a pencil or to apply clear coat in between each step, whereas I painstakingly painted them over the course of a few days. I don't say this as a way of talking down on myself. I'm saying this because I'm realistic. The truth is, I'm no artist. I'm just an ordinary person. But most importantly, I'm a fan. I had a vision for what I wanted this build to be, and I refused to let anything stop me from bringing that vision into reality. I painted this through sheer willpower and brute force alone. My philosophy during this build was that if you throw enough stuff at the wall, eventually something is bound to stick. So my message to you is this: you don't need to be an artist to make something like this. You don't need to be an expert at polishing or a professional body tech in order to achieve a finish like this. You can take things slow. You can make mistakes, you can screw up clear coating, you can drop your freshly painted props. None of that matters. The only thing you need is the unwavering determination to see it through. To those of you that made it this far, you're the ones that I need to say thank you to the most. Both your support and viewership means the world to me. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This was a project that's lived rent-free in my mind for quite a while now, so it's a good feeling getting it out of my mind and onto the shelf. I hope you guys aren't tired of seeing Darth Vader helmets, because my next project is going to be a special one. Personal preference, but Darth Vader's appearance in the Kenobi series is by far my favorite. So my next big project will be an extremely accurate Obi-Wan Kenobi Darth Vader helmet modeled by Levi 3D. So if that's something you'd be interested in seeing, then please consider subscribing. So until then, take care, and I'll see you guys next time.